His wit was legendary, his literary work showed signs of brilliance, and his lifestyle made him, for a time, amongst the most celebrated artists of his age. Yet his spectacular fall was unprecedented, only equaled in modern times by the disaster that was O.J. Simpson. Oh yes, in this week's Biographics we are diving into the outrageous life of the self-proclaimed genius Oscar Wilde. Oscar Fingal O'Flaherty Wills Wilde entered the world on October 16, 1854. The flamboyance of his name was a portent of things to come. His parents, they were socially prominent Anglo-Irish Protestants, each with eclectic interests, a belief in national politics, and a publishing career of their own. Oscar's father, William, was a renowned physician specializing in the eye and ear. He was a slight, unkempt figure with an ugly beard and a roving eye. But this absolutely did not stop him carrying on numerous affairs throughout his marriage, and he fathered several illegitimate children. In contrast to her husband, though, Oscar's mother Jane was especially elegant and statuesque. She was almost 6 feet tall and towered over her husband. She was a woman who longed to make a sensation, once stating that, "I should like to rage through life, this orthodox creeping is too tame for me." And, well, you probably guessed that this was the attitude that her son would quickly embrace. When Oscar, her second son, was 8 months old, Jane described him as a great stout creature who minds nothing but growing fat. Jane had actually wanted a girl and is said to have dressed Oscar and treated him as a daughter for the first decade of his life. At age 9, Oscar, along with his older brother Willie, was sent to his first school, the Portora Royal Boarding School in Enniskillen, far in the Protestant north of Ireland. Oscar was younger than most of his peers, though. At first, he was eclipsed by his older brother, but by the time that Willie was set to leave Portora, he had been superseded academically by Oscar. In fact, the younger Wilde was intellectually far ahead of his classmates. In 1889, he recalls, "I was looked upon as a prodigy by my associates because quite frequently I would, for a wager, read a 3-volume novel in half an hour, so closely as to be able to give an accurate resume of the plot of the story. By 1 hour's reading I was enabled to give a fair narrative of the incidental scenes and the most pertinent dialogue." In 1871, Wilde won a scholarship to study classics at Trinity College, Dublin. He arrived there in 1873 at the age of 18. There, he was tutored and befriended by Reverend John Pentland Mahaffy, professor of ancient history. Mahaffy inspired his pupil to be proficient in Greek, and in 1875, he won the prestigious Berkeley Gold Medal in Greek. 3 years later, in 1874, Oscar sailed to England to take the examination for a classics scholarship at Oxford University. While awaiting the results, he went to London and was dazzled by his first taste of the metropolis. After that, he travelled to another metropolis, and that was Paris. It was there, with his mother and brother, that he received news that he had won his scholarship, and had not only won it, but had achieved the highest mark of the entire group. Oscar, he absolutely made the most of his time at Oxford. It was during this time that he cultivated his aesthetic sensibilities, filling his room with lilies and spending vast portions of his father's money upgrading the decor of his room. It was at this time that he famously said, "I find it harder and harder every day to live up to my blue china." Wilde, he was never a fan of sport, but he did enjoy watching others play cricket and also run. He developed a reputation for his wit, proclaiming that the only possible exercise is to talk, not to walk. Still, he was absolutely no pushover. It is believed that once, while in his room, 4 undergraduates pounced on him to beat him up and smash his belongings. Wilde is said to have kicked out the first interloper, punched the second as he doubled over, hurled the third through the air, and carried the last back to his own room and then tossed him on the floor. Now, it was during his time at Oxford that Wilde became a Mason. He adopted the costume, velvet breeches, tailcoat, white tie, and silk hose, but his extravagant lifestyle, it was ultimately dented in April of 1876 when his father died, leaving a serious debt behind. Oscar, though, he still managed to find a way to indulge himself with semester holidays around Europe. Just prior to his graduation in 1878, he consoled his mother, distraught with financial worry, that "we have genius, that is something attorneys can't take away." Oscar, he emerged from Oxford with a degree and a clear vision of what was in store. In a remarkably prophetic couple of sentences, he declared, "God knows I won't be a dried-up Oxford don anyhow. I cannot live without desire, fear, and pain. Self-poised, self-centered, and self-comforted, I'll be a poet, a writer, a dramatist. Somehow or other, I'll be famous, and if not famous, notorious." In December of 1878, Wilde moved to London. He shared a flat with Frank Miles, a fellow Oxford graduate. During this time, he was introduced to many writers, artists, and actors. He soon gained a reputation for his wit and became a favoured dinner guest, where he would espouse his aesthetic values. He applied for various fellowships and even tried to become an inspector of schools. During all of this, he was working on his first play, Vera, which he privately printed in 1880. Vera was a story of noble socialism set in 19th century Russia. But unfortunately for Wilde, the New York and London producers that he sent the play to, they turned it down. In 1881, Oscar published 61 pieces of writing under the title Poems. An initial run of 750 copies had sold out, with 2 further printing runs being required. Meanwhile, during all of this, a play by the renowned team of Gilbert and Sullivan was indirectly making Wilde famous. It was called Patience, and it was a lampoon of the aesthetic culture that Wilde epitomized. The main character was clearly modeled on him. By June of 1881, Wilde's status was such that the Prince of Wales commented, "I do not know Mr. Wilde, and not to know Mr. Wiles is not to be known." Despite this ever-growing reputation, Wilde found himself in tough financial straits. He was offered and accepted a series of lecture tours around America to coincide with the New York opening of Patience. He set sail on Christmas Eve 1881 to instruct the New World in the English art of Renaissance. On arrival, he told the New York customs officer, "I have nothing to declare but my genius. But don't try this today, anyone." Well, the Americans, they were absolutely fascinated by him, and the original schedule was to be extended repeatedly in order to meet public demand. It would last almost a year, and it would even extend to Canada. Financially, he did very, very well out of this tour. He actually stayed in New York for 2 months after the tour's end. He then briefly returned to London in January of 1883 before relocating to Paris, where he immersed himself in artistic circles. It was at this point that he made himself over physically. He had his long flowing locks transformed into a bowl haircut and took to wearing a black overcoat. This was in great contrast to the flamboyant colours that he was previously known for. In May of 1883, Wilde returned to London, apparently motivated by his interest in a woman named Constance Lloyd, the daughter of a prosperous London lawyer. For the last few years, despite his American earnings, Oscar had certain money worries. The right marriage would also solve those problems while also answering the growing gossip about his sexual character. A year-long courtship followed, with the marriage taking place on the 29th of May 1884. The couple, they honeymooned in Paris, and then, thanks to his new father-in-law's money, occupied a 4-story house in London. He then went ahead and had the place redecorated at huge expense, which plunged the newlyweds into immediate debt. Wilde's first child, Cyril, was born on the 5th of June 1885, with Vivian following on November the 5th, 1886. With his writing career going nowhere, he agreed to a British lecture tour with topics such as the value of art in modern life. Lecturing and other invitations, they kept him away from his family home a lot. And during these long absences, he began to surround himself with young men, writing unguardedly of his infatuation with the beauty of the male form. He formed an especially close friendship with a 17-year-old named Robbie Ross. During the late 1880s, while bringing in money with occasional book reviews, Wilde worked on his first novel, The Picture of Dorian Gray. When the book was published in a magazine in 1890, it caused an immediate scandal. The storyline involved a subtly eroticized triangle of relationships between 3 men, and it was condemned by many as being immoral. Wilde had predicted such an outcome, having written the following in the preface: "There is no such thing as a moral or immoral book. Books are well written or badly written. That is all." It was around this time that Wilde was introduced to a blonde, fair-skinned undergraduate by the name of Lord Alfred Douglas, but who was known to his intimates as Boycie. Oscar quickly became obsessed with the 22-year-old. From this time on, Oscar saw Constance and his children less often. He did writings from rented addresses or hotels, usually with Boycie in tow. Boycie's father was actually the Marquis of Queensberry, the man who developed the rules of professional boxing. He took an immediate and intense exception to the relationship between his son and the famous Wilde. Apart from the homosexual aspect of their relationship, Queensberry was enraged that Wilde was distracting his son from his studies at Oxford. When Boycie quit his studies in May of 1893, the Marquis became determined to bring Wilde down. But it was around this time that Wilde finally achieved success on the stage. A Woman of No Importance opened on April 19, 1893, to widespread acclaim. During its run, it brought him between £170 and £200 per week. His next play, the satire An Ideal Husband, was also successful, providing the means for Oscar and Boycie to travel widely and live extravagantly. The Marquis of Queensberry thought his son's failure to take his degree in Oxford was a scandalous waste of time. He placed the blame squarely at the feet of Wilde, referring to the relationship as the most loathsome and disgusting. Queensberry began absolutely hounding the pair. He actually even threatened to disinherit Boycie. To this, the son replied with a telegram, "What a funny little man you are." Queensberry, not surprisingly, didn't like this one bit, and on the 19th of June, Queensberry burst in on Wilde at his Tithe Street address in London. He had a bodyguard with him and proceeded to threaten bodily harm unless the relationship ended immediately. So what was Boycie's reaction to all of this? Well, he wrote nonchalantly to his father, "I write to inform you that I treat your absurd threats with absolute indifference." The encounter, though, it unsettled Wilde, who got out of London for several months, going on holiday with his family to Worthing. This is where he worked on his latest play, The Importance of Being Earnest. But it wasn't before Boycie, unable to stay away, invited himself along, and as you might imagine, this caused a little bit of tension between Mr. and Mrs. Wilde. The Importance of Being Earnest opened to great applause on February 14th, 1895. 2 weeks later, it was already a wild success, and in true Oscar Wilde style, he began basking in the glow of this. It was at this point that Wilde called in at the lavish Albemarle Club. There he was handed a card from Queensberry by a porter. On this card was scrawled, "To Oscar Wilde, posing sodomite." At Boycie's urging, Wilde went to Marlborough Street Police Station to ask for a warrant for Queensberry's arrest on the grounds of libel. The case came to trial on April 3rd. Prosecuting counsel Edward Carson put on the stand a 16-year-old rent boy who claimed he'd been paid for sex by Wilde. Carson then went on to dissect works published by Wilde, revealing their supposed homosexual undertones. So, how did Wilde react to this rather serious event? Well, he chose to wield his celebrated wit as his main defensive tool. He was often funny, but the implicit superiority in his position, it was also damaging. In one exchange, when Carson asked whether the affection and love that is portrayed in the picture of Dorian Gray might lead an ordinary individual to believe it had a sodomitical tendency, Oscar replied, "I have no knowledge of the ordinary individual," which didn't exactly endear him to anyone. Wilde's counsel, Edward Clarke, also made serious miscalculations that did his client no favors. He went over letters that Queensberry had sent his son in an attempt to show how crazed the father had become. To the jury, though, Queensberry's volatility was driven by a paternal regard for Boycie's character. As Carson put it, his client had one hope alone, and that was simply saving his son. On the third day of proceedings, with things not exactly going brilliantly, Wilde, he chose not to attend. This was to prove the most damaging day yet, with Carson announcing that he intended to introduce a number of boys who would testify to shocking acts performed by Oscar. Now, without consulting his client, Wilde's lawyer Clarke offered to abandon the case. The defense, however, insisted that the original plea stand. The judge agreed and compelled an acquittal from the jury. Queensberry, he was found not guilty of libel against Wilde. It had now been proven that his written accusation of sodomy was not libelous. But now there was another important consequence. It left Wilde highly vulnerable to arrest for sodomy, which was a crime at that time in England. And, well, this is exactly what happened. At 5 in the evening of the day the libel case was decided, a summons was issued for the arrest of Oscar Wilde. The charge was committing acts of gross indecency. Hiding in the Cadogan Hotel, Oscar was urged by Boycie and others to take a boat immediately for France. Even his wife told him to run. However, this just didn't sit right with Wilde. He was determined to stand his ground, declaring, "I shall stay and do my sentence, whatever it is." At 6:10 p.m., 2 detectives arrived and took a semi-drunk Wilde to Bow Street Station. The arrest of Oscar Wilde caused an absolute sensation. Any friends that he still had quickly drifted away. Both of his currently running plays, they were cancelled, and his name very quickly became toxic. Wilde was kept in a cell in Bow Street, which was then Holloway Prison. Queensberry now administered the low blow of forcing a bankruptcy sale of Oscar's belongings, helped by a long list of angry creditors. By this time, Wilde was about $6,000 in debt. After making sure that Oscar had nothing of any physical value left, Queensberry wrote to a newspaper denying that he was capable of any sympathy for Wilde. He stated, "I have helped to cut up and destroy sharks. I have no sympathy for them, but have felt sorry and wished to put them out of pain as fast as possible." The trial, well, it ran from the 26th to the 29th of April. It was extraordinarily explicit in its allusions to sexual acts, many coming from the young men who claimed to have been partakers. Various Savoy Hotel employees testified that they had seen boys in Wilde's bed. However, Oscar's counsel was able to point out contradictions in testimonies, especially those of the rent boys. This all meant that the jury, they were unable to reach a verdict. But Wilde, he was not out of the woods as an almost immediate retrial began. Between the two trials, he did manage to secure bail, though stiff conditions were imposed. He tried to stay at a number of hotels, only to be told at each that he was unwelcome. He finally managed to find lodgings with his brother Willie. The second trial, it began on May the 22nd at the Old Bailey. This time, after 2 hours of discussion, the jury returned with a verdict of guilty. The sentence? Well, that would be 2 years of hard labor. Wilde was taken to Pentonville Prison. The wooden bed in his cell has sheets and rugs, but no mattress. A tin pot was provided for his toilet. The prison clothes, they were also not exactly his accustomed style of dress. Wilde was also compelled to walk on a treadmill senselessly for 6 hours each day and allowed to exercise outdoors for 1 hour. He was also forced to make postal bags. For 3 whole months, he had no outside contact, and after that, things were not much better, with him only being allowed to write 1 letter. The regime was absolutely brutal, Wilde recalling 3 punishments authorized by law: hunger, insomnia, and illness. In September of 1895, he received a visit from Constance, who found the experience awful, more so than any conception of it could be. Constance reported that Wilde professed a rejection of his former conduct and begged her for forgiveness for his madness during the last 3 years. She decided to stand by her weak rather than wicked spouse. Still, she abandoned his name, referring to herself as Constance Holland. When Boyce heard about Oscar's rejection of his former lifestyle, he was heartbroken. He wrote, "I am not in prison, but I think I suffer as much as Oscar, and in fact more." That was probably not the case though, because prison, it was obviously pretty rough. In October, he actually came down with dysentery. Then, on November the 21st, he was transferred to Reading Prison. At Clapham Junction Station, he was spat on and ridiculed by the crowds. Here, though, conditions, they were improved, and his duties, they were lighter. He was finally released on May the 19th, 1896. Oscar was booked into the Hotel Sandwich in Dieppe in northern France, living off the generosity of the few friends who had stood by him. By now, Constance had decided on divorce, and suffering herself with spinal paralysis, had put off any reunion. Between June and July of 1897, Oscar wrote his last major work, The Ballad of Reading Gaol. The subject, well, that was underlining the need for reform in Britain's prison and justice systems. Life in Dieppe, it was excruciatingly lonely for Oscar. Society at large shunned him, and he spent day after day alone and miserable. Finally, his resolve collapsed, and he wrote to Boyce, inviting him to come and stay. They reconciled on August the 28th, with Wilde bursting into tears at the sight of his one true love. When Constance heard of her husband's behavior, she wrote to him forbidding any return to your filthy, insane life. When he refused to give up Boyce, she cut him off completely. Once the initial passion subsided, it became clear that both Wilde and Boyce were different than their pre-trial selves. Boyce, he felt a duty to help Wilde, but this was no longer tied to love. On December the 3rd, Boyce left for Naples and did not return. Oscar's last 2 years, mostly in Paris, they were pitiful. He drank, hired men, and begged. Acquaintances, they were few. Constance Holland sadly died aged 40 after an operation on her back on April the 7th, 1898. Then, in April 1900, Wilde went with an acquaintance named Harold Meller to Rome, where he received the Pope's blessing. A month later, he was in Paris and suffering from ill health, which he attributed to food poisoning. His skin was irritable and frequently came out in rashes. By September, he was completely bedridden. On October the 10th, he was operated upon for an ear infection. The operation did not go well, and he got worse. Still, he did insist on continuing to drink absinthe and champagne. On November the 25th, a diagnosis of acute inoperable cerebral meningitis was reached. From here on, Oscar drifted in and out of consciousness and even sanity. At 5:30 the following morning, a death rattle began. Minutes after his demise, his body actually sort of exploded, fluid pouring out of several orifices. Oscar Wilde, well, he died as he had lived, inappropriately, outrageously, and with scant reference to what decorum demanded. So I really hope you found that video interesting. If you did, please do hit that thumbs up button below, and do not forget to subscribe for brand new videos every Monday and Thursday. We've got loads of other people just like this. Also, check out a couple of videos from the archives over there on the right. And as always, thank you for watching.
Hello again, just jumping in real quick to add something now that video was over. Obviously this is recorded later. We want to get your opinion on something. We've made some t-shirts that go along with this video. We're thinking about doing it for other biographics that we put together. Please do check out the link in the description below. We've got some t-shirts with Oscar Wilde quotes on them. Do check it out. Let us know what you think in the comments. We'd love to hear from you and whether you'd like to see more stuff like that. And again, thanks for watching.